Welcome everybody. Today I'm going to be doing a Halloween special based on Contact Report 490. Okay, so this thing, there you go. 1 second, I need to move you guys from my screen. Okay, there you go. Okay, so it is that time of the year. Orange pumpkins, spooky sounds, ghostly tales, trick-or-treating. It's a perfect time for good scary Halloween storytelling. And today's presentation is about the roots of the scariest story in our history. Can you guess what that is? Of course, overpopulation. Although we all know the story quite well, today's Halloween special is actually about witch hunting. But before I begin, beware, this presentation is not appropriate for children. It contains graphic violence, sexual content, and it could potentially be disturbing to general audiences. So viewer discretion is advised. In today's agenda, I'm going to talk about, again, the roots of the population explosion, the role of witch hunting, the destruction of knowledge, life energy, destruction of contraceptive knowledge, and the reduction of sexuality and human breeding, church inquisition, torture, mass murder, burning of witches, and the destruction of popular medicine, witch persecution, and population development. So it's going to be a pretty long one. Okay. So the population explosion is actually a chapter from a contact report. It's not a chapter, it's part of the contact report 490. And it's a chapter of the book, The Rediscovery of the Living by Bernard or Bern Cerf. And Billy obtained permission from the author to be published in this specific contact report. So this is based on that. So as we all know, some of the symptoms of overpopulations are environmental pollution, degeneration, epidemics, terrorism, racial hate, food shortage, etc., etc. But basically today's story is about how it all began. The initial spark of the population explosion did not occur in today's world as we think, but in Central Europe. And from there, in the course of colonialism, it spread like a chain reaction to today's third world. So what is the role of witch hunting? Well, again, it is the main historical root of the population explosion, where not advances in modern medicine and hygiene, but actually the systematic eradication of women's originally widespread knowledge of natural contraception and the systematic channeling of sexuality for the purpose of reproducing human beings, while at the same time demonizing all forms of lust-oriented sexuality that didn't lead to procreation. So the originator of this systematic breeding program, if you want to call it, was the church. Of course, it was the church. And the essential means of this implementation was the persecution of witches and the destruction of wise women, and therefore the destruction of knowledge, of life energy. So the witches of earlier centuries were not evil, hunchback old women with a cat on their shoulders and practicing evil spells as they are told in many fairy tales. Rather, they were wise women with a great deal of knowledge about health, illness, and healing, as well as about questions of sexuality, contraception, pregnancy, and birth. They were the bearers of folk medicine based on natural healing methods, including life energy methods and the affirmation of life. And the emphasis on pleasure were also expressed in their rituals and celebrations. The witches felt connected with the flowing life energy within themselves. They often had a strong sexual charisma. They could connect with their cosmic energy, which they called it the gray goddess. Um, they lived from a spiritual and had not been possible in the frozen male-dominated structures for the church for centuries, obviously. So the transmission of application of all this wisdom enable women to decide about their bodies, about procreation, about pregnancy and birth, and to conceive or bear children only when they also wanted to. And the will to do so depended on whether the child could be expected to have sufficient material basis of existence or a life worthy of human beings, meaning they have what they need, right? The things that we have talked about in the past from overpopulation. If you're going to have a kid, make sure it has food, a shelter, love, all the good stuff. So if there were no prospects in this respect, but only hunger, poverty, exploitation, oppression, then the women had little motivation to bring children into the world. And the witches knew how to prevent or avoid this when it was not desired. So there was knowledge. It was spread all over the world by the way of effectiveness of certain plants. For example, processed into tea and administered to women, it prevented conception for several years. There's a book that I forgot to put in here that is called Eve's Herbs and talks about several of these teas. And I will talk to you guys more about this specific topic at the end of the presentation. So in this way, women were able to live about their sexuality without the constant fear of unwanted pregnancy. In Europe, this knowledge had already been tabooed in the Middle Ages under the influence of the church and had been pushed underground, where it was guarded by witches and passed on, on to other women again and again. But why was the church basically wanting to get rid of all this knowledge completely? Well, it was actually economic and sexual economic interests. And with the persecution and extermination of the witches, the church would have killed two birds with one stone, so to speak, right? So the beginning of the systematic witch hunt does not coincide with the time where the population in Europe shrunk dramatically due to climate-related famines, devastating economic crisis, and the Great Plague in the middle of the 14th century. In some areas, actually, 70% of the population have been wiped out. But as a result, the number of serf farmers and the additional product they produce, the basis for the levy on the feudal lords, had also fallen dramatically. And with it, the source of wealth for the nobility. So in some places, this source of wealth threatened to dry up completely, and this could also cause the basis of the social power and the rule of the nobility to falter more and more. So on one hand, the nobility tried to reduce their loss of wealth by increasing taxes and pressure the peasants in bondage. On the other hand, this was precisely what provoked more and more resistance on the part of the peasants, which resulted in peasants' revolts. Under such devastating economic circumstances, rural women were less and less inclined to give birth to children. But now the biggest landowner of that time was, guessed again, the church, which they saw this economic power dwindling more and more. So large landowners without rural population who work the lands of the serfs no longer produce wealth. So the church superiors came up with a strategy of how could they get or force women to give birth to as many children as possible in order to produce population growth and regenerate the source of exploitation of human labor in the countryside. So from these considerations, the persecution of witches was created in 1484. The direction and the actual purpose of the witch hunt are unmistakable. They are directed against all knowledge and abilities of witches in the field of contraception and abortion, as well as lust-oriented sexuality. The application and passing of such knowledge was criminalized and punished with death. The destruction of contraceptive knowledge alone would not have guaranteed stronger offsprings. So to achieve this goal, sexuality in its main forms of expression and experience was also reduced to heterosexual intercourse between spouses only. So the corresponding laws, or these kind of stupidity laws, were adopted by the state, the emperor, and everybody that had power. So the persecution of witches then spread throughout Europe. The Catholic and the Protestant church, as far as the persecution of witches is concerned, is pretty marked with traces of blood. Both churches have not yet to come to terms with this dark chapter in their history, nor have they officially admitted, let alone apologize for even one of these millions of murders. Well, after all, it took the Catholic Church 350 years to officially admit that Galileo was right about that Earth revolves around the sun, and that is not the center of the world. So how long do you think it will take until the churches admit their guilt about the Holocaust of the witches? Yeah, never. So to convict the witches for their alleged crimes, they first had to be identified as witches. Accordingly, the Inquisition sent an army of men across the country who called on the population to spy and denounce them and paid a bounty for every report of a witch. The denunciation of women as alleged witches has become a flourishing business for many. If the alleged witches were wealthy themselves, it also became a business for the church because the assets of these women were confiscated. How about that? So in order to denounce a woman as a witch, the slightest suspicion or even malice on the part of the denunciators was enough. The Inquisition then checked by means of a witch test whether the suspicion was justified. A witch test, for example, consisted of examining the women for the so-called devil marks, and it was assumed that witches could only practice their craft in a covenant with the devil and had a sexual relationship with the devil, which must have left his mark on the person's on the devil's mark. So the devil's mark was literally similar to a birthmark, but if it was not visible at first sight, then the woman had to expose herself bit by bit before the eyes of the inquisitor. If there were still not a mark, then the hair was gradually shaved off. The hair of the head, the hair of the armpits, and finally also the pubic hair. If there was still no sign of the devil, the vagina was palpated. And if this is also was not a reliable result, then the nail test or the water test follow. Then there was another one, right? The acid test. The acid test was the woman's body was punctured 100 times with long nails, and it was assumed that an inner devil mark was characterized by the fact that did not react to a puncture with pain or bleeding. Once such a mark had been found, which is pretty much in everybody's body, the woman was convicted as a witch and was publicly burned at the stake. The water test consisted of the suspected woman being tied by her arms and legs and then thrown into the water, which was believed to be able to free herself from her bonds and covenant with the devil and through supernatural powers. So women who could somehow free themselves from their ties were thus convicted as witches and were burned. The others who did not succeed were not convicted, but drowned. Death by burning or drowning, these two were the alternatives for women who had been denounced by others and suspected as witches because of the hunt for the bounty or for any other base motives. In doubt against the accused was the motto. In any case, the surefire test removed any doubt. For the inquisitors, who were themselves subject to celibacy, the witch trials were a welcome outlet for their pent-up and sadistically perverted sexuality. The public burning of witches had a similar function for the masses. For the more the witch hunts condemned lustful sexuality as fornication and punished with death, the more a climate of sexual hostility and sexual fear spread, which dammed up sexual energies and could only find its outlet in destructive discharge. In this respect, the public burning of witches also fulfilled an important mass psychological function. Another aspect of witch persecution was the torture of the alleged witches in order to obtain a confession from them and to force them to denounce other women. In torture chambers, their limbs were torn apart and turned from their bodies, and other cruelties were committed against them until they were tortured to death. On their bodies torn apart and cut open in such a way, one could now study the human body if constructed from the inside. This was the beginning of anatomy, one of the foundations of modern medicine. So after the witch's wisdom and knowledge of the functions of sexuality and life energy and the energetic methods of prevention and healing derived from them have been eradicated, it was no longer possible to imagine a life energetic understanding of illness, health, and healing at all. The catastrophic state of health of the population, which was reflected among other things in high numbers of fatal pregnancies and stillbirths, as well as increased infant mortality. It was to a large extent only the consequence of the preceding destruction of folk medicine, the carriers of which have been the witches and midwives. So with the extermination of witches and midwives, antenatal care and obstetrics were increasingly transferred to men and eventually became their domain. Women were completely pushed out of this activity or relegated to subordinate auxiliary services, and the men, however, had no idea of how the natural functions of female sexuality work, or pregnancy, or birth, and now they try to reduce their deficit by dissecting female bodies. So the result of this strategy of church and state to increase human production was not long in coming. Although the witch hunt led to millions of victims among the women, it also drove the average number of children of the surviving women so high that an exponential population growth was initiating. So this is basically where the historical roots lied. This is where the population explosion began. Summary. I want to say so much about this. I read this report so many times, and every time was so hard. And I would like to say this is all in the past, and we're different now, and we learned so much from our awful mistakes. But the reality is that we haven't changed much. It's been more than 535 years since this mess started. And today, there's still witch hunting in India. In Afghanistan's horrifying medieval executions as women are beheaded and stoned to death just for chatting to men. Just last month, there was this woman, Masha Amini, a 22-year-old Iranian, arrested for wearing her headscarf too loosely by morality police, and she was beat to death in their patrol car on the way to the detention center, and it was witnessed by other people. So the father told the Iranian news outlet that he was not allowed to see her body in the hospital, but he caught a glimpse of her foot and it was bruised. So reports indicate that her death was caused by a skull fracture from the heavy blows to the head, according to the Associated Press. The same month, Iran Human Rights reported that at least 201 people were killed by security forces confronting protests across the country. Another example is just the Roe versus Wade overturn here in the United States. Just don't get me started on that one, right? Wait, no, but Saudi Arabia. Okay, that one. Last month, there was a video released on Twitter showing security forces just beating girls and women at an orphanage. Now, here, south of the border, Ciudad Juarez, Mexico, is nicknamed the capital of murder women. How about that? In February 2005, 370 bodies of women have been found and more than 400 were missing, not counting the ones that were not even reported, right? And some key facts about the World Health Organization page about specifically violence against women says that globally, about 1 in 3 women worldwide have been subjected to either physical or sexual intimate partner violence or non-partner sexual violence in their lifetime. Most of this violence is intimate partner by somebody they know. Worldwide, almost 1/3 of women aged 15 to 49 years who have been in a relationship report that they have been subject to some sort of physical and sexual violence by their intimate partner. So yeah, these are just some of the things that we sort of know. Like if you start researching anything from women being violence on women, stoning, witch hunting, you'll be pretty disturbed by everything that you can find. So these are some of the reference that from the places that I got the information. Obviously, Future Mankind. I'll post all these links in the chat so you guys can do some research yourself. And that's it, you guys. Thank you and happy Halloween.